It's official. Donald Trump has chosen Rex Tillerson to be America's next Secretary of State. Hi, everyone. I'm Bianna Golodryga, and this is Yahoo News Now. Tillerson is the CEO of Exxon Mobil, one of the largest companies in the world. He also might have the closest relationship to Russian President Vladimir Putin than any other U.S. citizen. Trump tweeted, "The thing I like best about Rex Tillerson is that he has vast experience at dealing successfully with all types of foreign governments." This comes as U.S. intelligence says Russia meddled in the U.S. election, which is likely to lead to new sanctions against Russia. It's also led to a new bipartisan investigation in Congress. Rhode Island Senator Jack Reed is one of the 4 bipartisan senators who called on that investigation. He sits on the Select Committee on Intelligence and joins us from Providence, Rhode Island. Senator, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Bianna.
So I want to begin with what we've seen play out over the last hour or so. Of course, the president-elect was expected to give a conference today about how he planned to separate himself from his business entity. He has postponed that press conference. Instead, he has taken a meeting with Kanye West, and unlike what we've seen with other people he's met with, he actually escorted him back down to the lobby to be photographed and gave a brief interview. What did you make of that?
Well, I think first it's essential that the president-elect clarify his business dealings because particularly with the latest activity of the Russians and at least indications or suggestions of prior involvement in some of his companies or some of his activities with some Russians, I think that has to be clear and made obvious to the American public. The American public has to understand and has to know that his sole motivation is the benefit of the American people and the interest of the United States and nothing else. So I think he should do that. As for these celebrity opportunities, that gives him an opportunity to speak, but I think it's more important that he act to make clear his financial position.
But what does that tell you, though, about how he prioritizes events and issues that we talk about on a daily basis, even events that he had planned and secured as he was expected today to talk about how he was going to divest himself from the business, instead taking a meeting with Kanye West and finding time for that? Does that cause concern about what issues he prioritizes?
Well, it raises the possibility that he will focus on things that are not central to the needs of the American public, and as a result, the time and effort that he needs to expend, and it's a very difficult job, will not be available. I mean, one of the things that was disconcerting to hear is that he is apparently foregoing daily intelligence briefings and will do it once a week. Well, you know, that's, I don't think, adequate. I think you have to be in touch with all the latest intelligence information. You have to have a sense of how it is changing, even small changes. And you have to be able to do that because when your advisors come and give you advice and suggest your proposals, you have to know a great deal to ask the right questions, to make the right decisions. So if this is going to be more about kind of peripheral, superficial celebrity activity rather than the hard, and trust me, it is very hard work of understanding the way government is functioning and how it should function and working hard to make it and improve it, make it better and improve it, then I don't think that would be serving the people appropriately.
Yeah, the president-elect said that he was a, quote, smart man and didn't need these briefings on a daily basis. Meantime, the week that the CIA and FBI confirmed that Russia intervened in the U.S. election system, with one even going further, the CIA saying that Russia helped Donald Trump win the presidency, the president-elect nominates the man who is arguably Vladimir Putin's closest contact in the U.S. What do you make of that?
Well, once again, it raises the issue of the relationship of this administration with Russia at a time when Russia has demonstrated very clearly it has some very malign attitudes towards the United States. Our intelligence agencies confirmed that they were engaged in hacking into the systems of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. They selectively seem to release only information against the Democratic candidate, not the Republican candidate. So that raises a question of purpose and motivation that we're going to try to get to. But then when you appoint someone who has very close dealings with Putin personally, it suggests that they're not properly taking into consideration the demonstrated behavior of the Russian government, particularly Putin's behavior.
Yeah, and from a business perspective, Rex Tillerson is perceived as a highly successful CEO, a great deal maker. I guess the question is, how is he going to be able to approach the world not through the lens of, let's say, Exxon Mobil foreign policy, but that of U.S. foreign policy? For example, we know he was against the Russian sanctions as a CEO. One of his closest business associates is, in fact, on that sanctions list. What do you need to hear from him during the confirmation process that will reassure you that he's not approaching foreign policy through the lens of Exxon Mobil?
Well, I think the fact, as you've pointed out, that he was publicly opposed to the sanctions, and this is after Russia had invaded the Crimea, a great disruption of international order and the rule of law. We're conducting, through surrogates, military operations in the eastern Ukraine. Arguably had contributed to, or indeed their crews shot down a civilian airliner, and not to impose sanctions seems to me to be the height of irresponsibility. Fortunately, the president and our European allies were able to summon the will and determination to put the sanctions in place. So he would have to explain very seriously why he thought that was not a good idea given the provocations. And then he has to make it very clear going forward that he is totally divorced from any type of either personal or monetary benefit from the activities of his oil company with respect to Russia and with respect to other countries. And then also has to lay out, I think, a very serious agenda of how he and the president are going to confront the provocations that the Russians seem more and more intent on presenting to not just the United States, but to Europe and to our allies.
Yeah, and this, of course, comes as Main Street establishment Republicans have vouched for Tillerson. Everyone from Condoleezza Rice to Bob Gates to Stephen Hadley to James Baker. But others, like Marco Rubio and John McCain, have voiced concerns. Do you think that he'll ultimately be confirmed?
Well, the process is such now that it would take 51 votes for confirmation, and unless there are some significant defections from the Republican side, based upon, again, their judgment, and I respect my colleagues, and Senator McCain and I work very closely together, Senator Rubio and I have worked together, so, if they look carefully and decide that regardless of his qualifications, and Mr. Tillerson is an extremely talented gentleman and someone who has done extraordinary in his business career, but if they feel that he doesn't have the right both attitude and approach to Russia or to any place else, and they vote against him, there's a possibility. But I think the numbers would suggest, to be honest and frank, that his confirmation would be very difficult to stop.
And meantime, though, I want to go back to the extraordinary conclusions that U.S. intelligence agencies have come to, that Russia meddled in the U.S. election. It's something that the president-elect continues to deny. One would think that this wouldn't be a partisan issue that it has become. You and your colleagues across the aisle are now calling for an investigation. My question to you is, why has it taken elected officials from the White House to Congress so long to respond? And secondly, we know how long these investigations take. Do you expect to get to the bottom of it under a soon-to-be elected president who doesn't believe this happened?
Well, first, it took a bit of time for the intelligence community to assemble all the facts to come to a conclusion that they had high confidence in. Then it was presented to members of the Senate and members of the House. Weeks ago, I joined some colleagues in writing and requesting that the president accelerate as rapidly as possible the release of as much information as he could. He has committed to release whatever he can very quickly. That document that the president sends to us, I hope will have sufficient facts so it will form the basis for our investigations on the Armed Services Committee. And I hope we can pursue this very vigorously and very aggressively. We want to give the American public sort of the facts, and give them the perspective of what we think this all means. But then we also want to be able to be in a position to take steps because the next election cycle has already begun. In 2 years, we'll elect another Congress. In 4 years, it's another presidential race. And if the Russians have been operating this way in 2016, then unless we are able to take proactive and preventive steps, they could be even more damaging in 2020 or 2018.
Yeah, and Russia, of course, has been accused of meddling in elections not only in the U.S., but in Europe as well. So how do you expect a president like President Trump to hold Russia accountable if he refuses to acknowledge that anything, in fact, was done?
Well, that's where, at some point, the abundance of facts has to overcome the reluctance to attribute actions to the Russians. I think that will happen. I hope it happens. But the most decisive factor will be the American people. If the facts are presented to them and they overwhelmingly concur that, in fact, the Russians did intervene, they had some deliberate motives to do that, that this type of behavior is unacceptable, particularly going forward in our electoral process, that overwhelming response by the people, if that doesn't convince the president, then that's a very, very serious situation.
But Senator, other than Vladimir Putin coming out and saying, yes, I specifically intervened in your elections and wanted Donald Trump to become your next president, what would those facts need to be? Because I'm asking this because the next most important position in the U.S. diplomacy is Deputy Secretary of State. You know that John Bolton's name has been thrown out there as a possible pick for that job. This is the same man who said the CIA's finding that Russia intervened could be a false flag operation. He's very hawkish. Do you think that he could be confirmed?
Again, I think what you come down to is you have to look carefully at the qualifications, the proposed policies, and then there has to be a evaluation by individual senators, but just the mathematics of the situation, unless there is significant Republican opposition, it would be very difficult to stop a confirmation process for a cabinet position or a sub-cabinet
Would you vote
position.
against him or for him?
But I would, I think, in all fairness, look very closely at what he said, what he proposes to do. I don't think it's appropriate to just prejudge someone without giving them the benefit of at least making the case. So I'm looking very closely at all of these appointees, and I think that's only fair.
And lastly, you talked about this earlier, President Obama ordering an expedited review in his remaining weeks in office of just how Russia was able to pull off the cyber attack. Do you think, as some of his critics say, that he has been too weak on Vladimir Putin from everything from Ukraine to Syria? As we know, Aleppo has fallen back to Syrian forces by and large. A lot of his critics say that it is, in fact, President Obama who put us in this weaker position vis-a-vis Vladimir Putin. What are your thoughts on that, and what's your response?
Well, I think the president announced, with respect to Syria, a red line with respect to chemical weapons. I think once that red line was crossed and we didn't take action, that sent a signal to both our allies in the region and perhaps even to the Russians and Syrians that they might proceed more aggressively.
So you view that as a mistake?
That I think, I think in retrospect, I think having to do it over again. I think the rule of thumb is don't draw a red line unless you're prepared to enforce that red line. And I think that has had adverse consequences. I think also, though, it gets complicated in the sense that, he does not get credit, for example, for rallying the Europeans who weren't that enthusiastic to impose significant sanctions against Russia after their activities in Ukraine, to maintain those sanctions. For the United States, those sanctions aren't as costly as it is for many countries in Europe who depend upon energy, for example, from Russia. So that has been something I think he's done with great skill and ability. So I think time will tell, but I think there are areas in which one can raise questions about the performance and other areas where you can give him credit for taking some very difficult and complicated steps.
Yeah, though it is looking more and more likely that new leadership in Europe could really question whether or not these sanctions will hold from a European perspective, from a U.S. perspective as well. So we shall see, Senator. We'll have to leave it there. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us. And stay with Yahoo News for all the latest on the Trump transition, the investigation into Russia's hacking, and much more. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and let us know what you think about everything you've just heard. I'm Bianna Golodryga. Thanks for watching.